things about safety. Safety is very important to us here at Shoreline, so we have life jackets on board. Life jackets are located in the big white boxes underneath the wooden benches, all around the upper and the lower deck. If there's an emergency of any sort, the deckhands will issue life jackets to each and every person on board. They'll show you how to put them on, and they'll tell you what you need to do. It's very important to listen to the deckhands and the tour guide. I trust them. You should too. We also have some rules on board. One of those rules is no standing on the chairs, no standing on the benches, no leaning over the side of the boat. You'll also notice this steel frame up here. This steel frame is one of the boundaries of our vessel. You don't want to put your hands or heads above the steel frame at any time, as we pass very, very close to some of the bridges, and you will lose something if you violate that rule. We also ask you to please be considerate to the other passengers on board who want to hear the tour. If you need to have a loud conversation or talk on your cell phone, please do so downstairs. There's stairs in the back. Those stairs lead downstairs, where we have additional seating, washrooms, and of course our full-service cash bar. If anybody's wondering where people are getting these refreshing beverages from, they're getting them from Albert downstairs, the very best bartender at Navy Pier. He'll mix you up any kind of drink you could dream of. We have icy cold beer, icy cold water, all sorts of mixed drinks, alcoholic and not. Frozen mixed drinks like frozen strawberry daiquiris and frozen pina coladas. His recommendations today are spicy Bloody Marys, Mai Tais, vodka lemonades, gin and tonics, and whiskey cokes. So be sure to check that out. Well, in honor of this beautiful sunny day, we brought out our very best tour guide, Jeff. He's going to tell you as much as he possibly can about the city of Chicago and its architecture over the next hour. So how about a big warm welcome for Jeff? Hey!
My name is Jeff. I'll be your tour guide or docent today as we float down this Chicago River. How you guys doing? Excellent. That was a moderate amount of enthusiasm. I'll try and bring that same level of enthusiasm to the next 60 minutes. I usually like to start just by pointing out this plot of land we have here off to our left, surrounded by that low white wall. Not a whole lot going on there right now. But that's supposed to be the future site of DuSable Park, which would commemorate this area's very first permanent resident, Mr. Jean-Baptiste Pont DuSable. He came here around 1779 in order to establish trade with the Native Americans. Not very much is known about Mr. DuSable. It is known that he was of French as well as Haitian descent. But besides that, just he was the very first permanent resident of the Chicagoland area, and eventually get a nice riverfront park there to honor that man. For the time being, the boat harbor, and off to our right there, is known as DuSable Harbor. And just last year, Michigan Avenue Bridge was renamed DuSable Bridge. So all in honor of that very first permanent resident here in Chicago. I'd also like to mention this boat slip I'm going to be leaving from here today. It's this little L-shaped patch of water we find ourselves in here. It's known as the Ogden Slip, and it pays tribute to Chicago's first mayor, Mr. William Butler Ogden. He came here around 1835 to watch over some land that his brother bought in the area. But when he got here, he found himself knee-deep in mud, as well as the place smelled quite a bit. Chicago was nothing more than a swamp. So Mr. Ogden immediately wrote back to his brother, saying that they had been swindled, and he would try to sell off the land as fast as he could. He would sell just a third of that land for about 3 times its original value, so essentially making up for the entire purchase by just selling off a little chunk of that land. And I like to think that it was around that time Mr. Ogden might have realized that there's something to this place, decided to stick around. And he would stick around, and in just a couple of years, by 1837, Chicago would find itself in need of a mayor, as we were incorporated into a city. And Mr. Ogden would fulfill that need, beating out John Kinsey, famous fur trader in the area, for that first mayoral spot. We are going to be floating down this Chicago River here for the next 58 minutes. It's actually a pretty important river. Now, if it wasn't for this Chicago River, we might not have a city here at all. Now, the story goes all the way back to 1673, if you could imagine, back to 2 French explorers who went to map out the Mississippi. Now, their names were Jacques Marquette and Louis Joliet. They went all the way down south, down the Mississippi. On the way back up north, they had a Native American guide show them a little shortcut. You see, if you took the Mississippi River into the Illinois River, then the Illinois into the Des Plaines River, You could then pick up your canoe or whatever boating vessel you were on that day and carry it for about a mile. You'd reach this little 2 foot deep, 4 foot wide, sort of weed choked stream, just kind of trickled into Lake Michigan off behind us. Now, of course, this little stream is what would become this great Chicago River. And now it's about 20 to 25 feet deep, maybe as much as 200, 250 feet across this area up here. It's nothing that nature intended. We have had our way with the Chicago River, building it to suit our needs as we tend to do here as humans. But again, when the French came, nothing more than this small trickling stream, but they immediately saw the great potential of this Chicago River. And see if you could just dig a canal near the south end of this river and connect it to that Des Plaines River, you'd have the key to a vast inland trade route, essentially connecting the east coast in through the Great Lakes and going all the way through to the Gulf of Mexico, all via waterways. Now, this would not work out for the French, but it would work out for the United States. That newly formed state of Illinois in 1830 would finally propose the building of that canal to be called the Illinois-Michigan Canal, and it was after proposing that canal that Chicago got its start. By 1833, being incorporated into a town. I mentioned 1837, incorporated into a city. By 1848, that Illinois-Michigan Canal was complete. And then just a couple of years later, by 1850, Chicago had become one of the busiest port cities in the world. A whole lot of barges and schooners running up and down this river here, really teeming it with industry. This river was nicknamed the Golden Funnel for all the industry coming through here, making Chicago quite a bit of money. Coming up off to our right here, we do have Centennial Fountain. This is meant to commemorate 100 years since the founding of Chicago's Metropolitan Water Reclamation District. That district was founded in 1889. Centennial Fountain, of course, complete in 1989, 100 years later. And that Water Reclamation District would play a pretty important role in Chicago's history, which I'll get to a little bit later. I do like to mention there is this water spout out in front of Centennial Fountain. It actually shoots a giant arc of water across the river here. It goes off just about every hour on the hour for a solid 10 minutes, essentially halting boat traffic for 10 minutes every hour. I plan pretty much all of our trips around that fountain. But they've turned that off. Labor Day, that gets cut off, so no more fountain until Memorial Day. So it's a relief for me. I hate that fountain. The bane of my existence, really. Stops all my tours. I digress. But now, this being an architectural tour, I will mention some buildings. I'll start here with this Sheridan Hotel off to our right. I'd like to mention the green tinted windows here. This is a post-modern building, and post-modernism is known for its contextualism, just a big fancy word meaning it pays tribute to its location. The Sheridan Hotel is paying tribute to its location here on the Chicago River by those green tinted windows. They're meant to reflect the natural green color of this Chicago River, and it is a natural green due to the algae kind of floats in here, gives it that greenish hue. Now it does get a brighter green every St. Patrick's Day, and we do dye it a little bit brighter green. But another really big idea in postmodernism is to look back at old styles of architecture and reinvent them with your newly found resources. No better example of that than this NBC tower straight off to our right, done by Adrian Smith of Skidmore, Owings & Merrill in 1989. The NBC tower harkens back to the old Art Deco days, late 1920s. Art Deco was known for its soaring vertical lines. The NBC tower accomplishes by those darkened spandrels separating the windows there, giving a very machine-like look. Might also notice about 2/3 of the way up the building there, those upside-down L's look like big holes in the building. Those are known as flying buttresses, and they are paying tribute to the flying buttresses on the Chicago Tribune Tower, which is a near neighbor that we'll see here in just a moment.
For now, we have this University of Chicago Bleacher Center, the building with the beautiful riverfront view. Now, you'll notice as we float past the building that off to the side, there aren't really any windows to speak of. That's because this is home to the University of Chicago's Graduate School of Business. Those are the students' classrooms. The architect Dirk Lohan didn't think the students needed to be daydreaming out the windows of their classroom they should be learning. Yes, it is all business in the School of Business. Yeah, but now we have this Chicago Tribune Tower here. And those flying buttresses at the top that the NBC Tower was paying tribute to in its design. Now, in 1922, Colonel Robert R. McCormick held a contest to see who could design the most beautiful office building in the world. The winners were Howells and Hood with this design, modeled after the Butter Tower of the Rouen Cathedral in France. They won $100,000 for their design, but surprisingly enough, the second place design, that Tribune Tower contest, would actually have more influence on architecture here. I'll get to that story on the way back down the river, because right now we have the Wrigley Building here, home to the Chewing Gum King. The Wrigley Building's actually two buildings connected on the 3rd as well as the 14th floor by a couple bridges. It is known for its beautifully white glazed terracotta tiles that glow in the night. They're all lit up here. Also known for the clock tower at the top, modeled after the Giralda Tower in Sevilla, Spain. And then we have this recent addition to our skyline here, Trump's new building, Trump International Hotel and Tower. It's a pretty tall one. Now, if you go all the way to the tip of the spire on the top of Trump's building, which, architecturally speaking, spires do count in the height of a building. Now, antennae do not. I'm not sure what the distinction is there. One of them is functional, one is decorational. The decorational one counts. Now, if you go all the way to the tip of that spire, it's 1,388 feet, officially making Trump's building the second tallest building here in the city of Chicago. Now, but Trump's building has a few setbacks as you go up it. And these setbacks are referencing the heights of the surrounding buildings. You have the first setback, the height of the Wrigley Building. The next setback's at the height of the Marina City Towers, a couple doors down. And the final setback's at the height of this old IBM building, standing right next door here. And this is the tallest and final of some 60 buildings the architect Ludwig Mies van der Rohe did here in the city of Chicago. The Mies van der Rohe was known as the father of the modern school of architecture. He coined the phrase, less is more, or God is in the details. Very simplistic, inordinate designs to his buildings. And most of this glass and steel box look is the general idea. And the beauty was supposed to be in the simplicity of it all. But Mies van der Rohe taught at the Bauhaus in Germany up until the 1930s when the Nazis came into power. Then he fled here to the United States and graced us here in Chicago with all of his beautiful boxes. But one of his students at that Bauhaus in Germany, Mr. Bertrand Goldberg, would listen to his teacher but then go on to pretty much reject all of his ideas and build these two curvilinear structures right next door, known as the Marina City Towers. Now, Bertrand Goldberg said he was revolting against the straight line, against man-made in the image of a machine. He thought buildings should reflect shapes in nature. There are no straight lines or right angles in nature, only curves. So he designed very curvilinear buildings like these Marina City Towers here, and sometimes gets them the nickname of the Corn Cob Towers. They have sort of a corn cob-like appearance to them. But Marina City is also known as a city within a city. You might have noticed you could dock your boat, park your car, you had a restaurant, fitness center, bowling alley, a theater in the back, which is now home to the House of Blues, and of course a place to sleep up top. A paradise for shut-ins, really. But this is supposed to be the appeal behind the building. It was done back in the 1960s, back when the middle class was running out to the suburbs. And every city needs a strong middle-class tax base. So Bertrand Goldberg thought if he could provide all the modern amenities of a city within one building, he might keep that strong middle-class tax base here in the city of Chicago. Tell you a quick story about how Chicago got its name, Chicago. It actually comes from a Native American term, a Chicagua or Chicagua, something to that effect, which loosely translates as land of the stinking swamp grass, or land of the smelling onions. There are a few translations, they pretty much all include stinking or smelling, because this place did. It was a big swamp. There are these wild patches of onions that grew here, and as they rotted away into the swamp, they emitted a pretty foul odor that characterized this region for quite a period of time. But now, off to the right right, we have this low-lying red brick structure here. You might also notice some images of wheat adorning its facade. This is the old Reed Murdoch warehouse, and it is done in the Prairie School of Architecture. The Prairie School was popularized by Frank Lloyd Wright. This building is actually done by George C. Nimmons in 1913. The building is asymmetrical, and there is one more bay east of the clock tower than there is here west of the clock tower. Originally, the building was perfectly symmetrical, but by 1930, LaSalle Street Bridge in front of us here was being put in. In order to make way for the street, they had to just knock off one of the bays of the building. A new building coming up here. This is just an office building, around 50 stories tall. Goes by its address, 300 North LaSalle. Yeah, but then the building next to it, labeled the Chicago School out front here, it's actually the Helene Curtis building. It was formerly the old Chase and Sanborn coffee warehouse, where they say you could still smell the ghosts of old coffee beans haunting the hallways. It's very spooky to some. Now, this does represent the Chicago School of Architecture, a tripartite or three-part design, base, shaft, and capital. Here you have the white stone base, the red brick shaft, and the all-glass penthouse being the capital at the top. But now we're coming up to the largest building here in the city of Chicago, as well as the largest building in the world when it was complete in 1931 by Graham Anderson, Probst & White. Has since been surpassed by the Pentagon. Still is the largest building here in Chicago, though. It's, of course, the Merchandise Mart. And by large, I don't mean tall, I just mean very, very large. Like, it has 4.4 million square feet of usable floor space stretched out over the 25 stories. The Merchandise Mart takes up 2 city blocks. And the post office thought the building was so big, they give it its own zip code, 60654. It's just for the Merchandise Mart here. And it is done in the authentic Art Deco style that the NBC Tower was paying tribute to in its design. Again, you have those strong vertical lines running up the building. Now, you might have noticed these large heads, or the big busts standing out in front here on those pedestals. I believe David Letterman once referred to them as the Pez Hall of Fame. They're actually paying tribute to the great merchant princes of the Chicagoland area, such as Montgomery Ward, Marshall Field, Filene, Wanamaker, Woolworth, among others. But the Merchandise Mart was done at a very unfortunate time. I mentioned 1931, the Great Depression was looming here in the United States. And originally that building was owned by Marshall Field himself. But by 1945, Marshall Field had to let go of his Merchandise Mart due to owing the government a lot of money in back taxes after that Great Depression hit. And he would sell it to a man who had a little bit of money. Mr. Joseph P. Kennedy of the famous political family would buy the Merchandise Mart for around $13 million, around half its resale value at the time. Use it as a furniture showroom, which it still basically gets used for today. Yeah, but then by 1998, the Kennedy family would let go of the Merchandise Mart, selling it for somewhere around $600 million. Now we're here at a fairly historic point in the river, known as Wolf Point. It is the confluence, or the flowing together, of all the branches of the river. You have the main branch who just came down. The north branch lies ahead of us, and that south branch is going to be drifting up behind us. I mention this point in the river because it is historic in our city's sense. It was right around here along the riverbanks where some of the first buildings popped up in the Chicagoland area. It was at one of those buildings, the Hotel Sauganash. A bunch of those original Chicago settlers gathered together and signed the charter to officially incorporate Chicago into a town. If you look off in front of us, there is a bridge standing upright. And if I don't mention it, I get asked the question, why is it standing upright? Yeah, it's just an old railroad bridge. It's no longer used. So to keep it up like this, keep out of the way the boat traffic comes through. Now, from what I hear, it is still fully functional. They just keep it up like this out of convenience sake. It's a really popular spot for wedding photos. Not sure why. Then off to the left, a little bit in front of us, there's that pink structure standing there. It's the old Fulton House, an old cold storage warehouse done by Frank Abbott in 1908. Now, of course, being a cold storage warehouse did not have any of the windows or balconies that you see in it today. The building has been renovated by Harry Weiss and Associates. Renovations were complete in 1981. Harry Weiss said getting involved at the Fulton House was the biggest mistake of his career. And he would have to wait an entire year just for the building to thaw out. And then not to mention punching all the deep holes in the building's facade to make all the windows and balconies you see in it today. If you look into those balconies, you can see just how thick those walls actually are. And all those walls were stuffed with horsehair, a means of of insulation in the early 1900s. But Harry Weese would go on to redeem his reputation, building these river cottages right next door here. You might notice a very triangular theme to the river cottages, a whole bunch of triangles playing out here. And I mention it because it seems to me that Harry Weese was obsessed with the triangle. Most of his buildings managed to incorporate triangles into them somehow, or are triangles in themselves. And I like to say that he was geometrically obsessed. See probably 2 more examples of this in the today. For now, back off to the right, we have this East Bank Club. This is done in the 1970s and represents a very old school way of doing things here on the river. You notice it just sort of has its back turned towards us, not really paying any attention to the river, just ignoring it at all costs. Now, it wasn't until recently they put all the trees and flower pots out back here, now trying to embrace the river. But right across the way, you have the very new school way of doing things. This is the Kinsey Park development. You notice that these buildings are set off the riverfront to make for a nice riverfront walkway for pedestrians as well as canines to occasionally enjoy. But the reason people used to build like this East Bank Club did is because this Chicago River has been hopelessly polluted throughout the years. One of the most abused waterways in human history, actually. And it wasn't until recently we started cleaning up the river here. But the story goes all the way back to the 1850s. Back when this big, bustling port city had a lot of barges and schooners running up and down the river here. They were dumping their oil, as well as who knows what else from the river. And Chicago was known as the meatpacking industry's capital to the world. And we were dumping some of those dead carcasses into the Chicago River. And if that wasn't bad enough, Chicago also had all of our city's sewer lines running right here into the Chicago River. So we were dumping all of our raw sewage into the river here. Now, this wouldn't have been too big of a problem, except for the fact that the Chicago River once flowed into Lake Michigan, which was, and still is, our city's source of drinking water. As you can imagine, poisoning your source of drinking water is not a very good idea. There are a lot of outbreaks of cholera, typhoid, dysentery, other waterborne illnesses. That's when Chicagoans realized we needed to clean up our city's source of drinking water. Now, the obvious solution might have been to stop throwing stuff into the river. But that didn't occur to anybody at the time. Now, what they thought is we just put water cribs about 2 miles off the shore of Lake Michigan, getting our water there, being further out, it would be cleaner. Well, apparently it wasn't. So that's when this water reclamation district came in the picture. If you remember Centennial Fountain near the beginning of the tour, remembering that water reclamation district. They were founded in 1889. And mainly just to come up with a solution to this whole drinking water problem that we had here. And they did come up with a pretty good idea. They thought, why not just reverse the entire flow of this Chicago River? And you see, that way, we keep dumping all of our garbage and all of our sewage into the river here, and it would float south. Down the Des Plaines, down the Illinois, and down the Mississippi River, and St. Louis could deal with it. This is actually what we did. And in 1900, the Shippen Sanitary Canal was complete. The basic idea is that you dredge up so much land from the south branch of the river, it's now lower than this north and the main branch, using Newton's great force of gravity to pull the river the opposite direction. This was a big success. To this day, the river still flows the opposite direction, and our city's source of drinking water was saved. But surprisingly enough, the people of St. Louis were not too thrilled. They actually filed a lawsuit against the city of Chicago. Now, maybe most surprising is that Chicago would go on to win that lawsuit, mainly due to a University of Illinois chemistry professor who said that when the sun came out and was shining down on these waters, it would oxidize all the pollutants, essentially cleaning the water on its way to St. Louis. Yeah, this isn't really true, but the judge bought it, got us off the hook. I'm sorry if any of you are from St. Louis. It wasn't my idea, of course. And we have been cleaning up the river here lately. It was just like 10 or 15 years ago, the Environmental Protection Agency officially upgraded the status of our river. It was upgraded from toxic to just hazardously polluted now. So moving in the right direction. Now, with the upgrade, you can go kayaking on the river. It's approved for that recreational use. You can also go fishing. Believe it or not, the wildlife has returned. Plenty of fish in the river now. They still don't recommend eating any of the fish. You just do it for sport. But now we have a lot of railways in this area here. Overhead, we get that elevated train, runs by every now and then. It is called the L, even though only a third of it is actually elevated. Even when it goes underground, still call it the L. Then off to the right, we have train tracks at the ground level. And these train tracks run all the way down the south branch of the river here. And you see, a long time ago, Chicagoans decided to set aside all this land for the railways, knowing that the east and the west were not connected. So people coming from the east or the west would have to stop here in Chicago and switch trains. And maybe when they'd stop, they'd spend a little bit of money on food or spend the night at a hotel. It just really meant to bolster our economy. And this worked fairly well. But it wasn't very long before they realized that this was some pretty valuable land. They wanted to use it for something more than just the railways. So they came up with this great idea known as air rights. The basic idea is that you could buy as much air above the railways as your heart desired. And you can put your building in that air by putting down a bunch of columns alongside the railways so as not to interrupt their flow. But then setting your building on top of those columns, sort of like stilts. The first example of this whole air rights concept is going to be this Boeing World Headquarters coming up off to our right, done by Perkins and Will in 1990. It was originally the Morton Salt Building, but again, now home to Boeing. And there is this taller tower here, flanked by a shorter one, kind of hanging off the side. There's a pretty good reason for that. Now, underneath the taller tower, the train tracks run perfectly straight. So there's plenty of room to put down your columns, so you're building on top of the columns. But under the shorter tower, there's what's known as a switching station. A bunch of train tracks coming together, converging on one spot. No room to put down any columns beneath. So how do you support this smaller structure if not from below? Well, you hang it from above. There is a system of cantilevered steel trusses on the top of this smaller tower, actually hanging it, and the same idea as a diving board on a much larger scale, of course. I'd like to mention that all these columns here along the ground level of this smaller tower serve no load-bearing function whatsoever. The architects put them there merely to ease pedestrians' minds. Thought if people saw a floating building, they might freak out. I do get a great view of those steel trusses now. Take a quick glance back. But then straight off to the right, we have Riverside Plaza, the very first building ever done on air rights here in Chicago. It was done by Hullabert and Root in 1929. Originally the old Daily News building, back when the great American poet Carl Sandburg used to write for us here in the city of Chicago. But again, a very unfortunate time. The Great Depression was looming. Now, original plans actually called for 2 giant sphinx heads, one on each side of the building. I guess King Tut's tomb was discovered in the 20s. Everyone's going through this big Egyptian craze. Well, of course, the Great Depression would hit. Hullabert and Root's budget would be cut. The first thing to go in their budget were the 2 giant sphinx heads they planned. But now if you look underneath this building, you get a pretty good idea of this whole air rights concept. You can see this Amtrak train running underneath here. And you can see some of those columns supporting the building above. Now the building above is known as Gateway 1. If you don't get a really good look at Gateway 1, there's no need to worry. Right next door, there's a building that looks exactly like it, known as Gateway 2. They are known as twin buildings, meant to commemorate 2 twin buildings standing here in Chicago, known as the Butler Brother warehouses. Gateway 1 and 2 were both done by Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill. The first in 1965, second in 1968. Both in this very modern school of architecture, popularized by Mies van der Rohe. It's sometimes called Miesian architecture, using Mies van der Rohe's name as an adjective. Just the glass and steel box look, really. Less is more. Well, by 1972, people started saying that less is a bore. And people were getting tired of this whole glass and steel box look. So Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill decided they would do Gateway 3 as a revolutionary new building. Yes, Gateway 3 would be a glass and stone box. It doesn't really break out of that modern school of architecture. But it doesn't fit in either, because a stone cladding is decorational, and modernism is all about stripping back all the ornamentation. So this makes up its own school of architecture called the International School. Call it that because you can pick the building up, put her down in any city in the world, and fit right in. Now we have this building with large X's on its frame. Originally, the Mid-American Commodities Exchange. I believe now home to fitness formula clubs as well as a corner bakery cafe. But I point out those X's because they are not decoration. They're actually serving the load-bearing function of the building, called external cross-bracing. You save on a third of your steel when you construct in this manner, because it makes for all wide-open floor space. No need for any interior columns, because the building is literally being held together from the outside. Now the building with that same external cross-bracing idea here in Chicago is the John Hancock Center. But now we have the final of the Gateway series of buildings, known as Gateway 4. Finally breaks into the postmodern school of architecture. The curve to the building, referencing the slight bend in the river here, as well as all that green tinted glass, again reflecting the green of the river, done by Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill in 1984. If you look here near the water level, you might notice this tree. It seems to be growing out of nothing more than a chunk of concrete. There are no visible signs of roots whatsoever. I have no idea how that tree continues to exist. I've worked here for 5 years. That tree continues to thrive. It's my favorite tree of the tour. But now, coming up to this large, rundown, sort of jalopy of a building. It's actually old post office. The one that was done in 1932 by Graham Anderson, Probst and White. It was the world's largest post office. And if you're wondering why we needed such a giant post office, I'll get to that story once we clear Congress Parkway up here. This tends to be a pretty noisy bridge, especially when traffic picks up, so I usually get a bit quiet as it passes underneath here. They've also been doing some construction on the parkway, which is why they have these 2 barges underneath here. But it looks like Congress Parkway is running right through the old post office. It is. The post office came first, left a big hole in the base of their building, knowing Congress Parkway was going to be built through soon after. This now connects to 290, which is a pretty busy highway here, so you're just kind of loud. It's kind of noisy in there. I take the opportunity to take a deep breath, take a sip of my flavored water. If any of you are thirsty, don't forget about Albert downstairs at the full service bar. He's willing to mix you up whatever your heart desires, so feel free to visit him anytime. But going back to the post office, why we needed such a giant one. Chicago is actually the mail order catalog industry's capital to the world. Started by Montgomery Ward, later taken off by Sears and Roebuck, among many others, all right here in the city of Chicago. So we thought we needed this giant post office to accommodate all that incoming and outgoing mail, and we were wrong. The main problem with the post office is that it relies too much on its height, having to move the mail up and down the floors, taking days at a time, let alone getting the mail out to the rest of the world. So the building was deemed archaic and inefficient, and it is currently vacant. No real future plans in store for the old post office. The most recent thing I was involved in, a little over a year ago, they're filming that Transformers movie here. It was labeled Department of Health and Human Services. You can look out for that. But right next door would get this new post office by Knight Architects in 1996. I lovingly call it the new post office. It is not featured in the new Transformers movie, but it does serve its purpose very well. The mail is laid out on just one floor here, and the post trucks can actually drive right into the building, pick up their mail, and drive right back out, which should make for some pretty speedy delivery. Now, unfortunately for Knight Architects in 1996, they made sort of a big deal about the grand opening of the new post office here. That first mail truck set to roll through the entranceway. They had all the media come out, all the cameras were rolling. As that post truck went to roll through the entranceway, it got stuck. Because apparently when they're measuring the height of the post trucks, they measured the height without any tires actually on the truck. So when the first truck came through with tires, it got stuck. Now what they had to do was let some of the air out of those tires so it could sink down enough to release itself from the entranceway. Very embarrassing. And of course, since then, the building has been renovated. Post trucks going in and out with much ease now. But Knight Architects have not done a building here in Chicago since. But now we're coming up on what I think is the most historic site of the tour today. It is the site of that great conflagration, or the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. Site of where Mrs. O'Leary's barn once stood. So off to the right here, there's that low brown building with one orange wall, a little bit off in the distance. That stands in the exact location there. And that building is now Chicago's Firefighting Academy. So we do have a unique sense of humor about the location. And if you haven't heard the story, it goes something like this. This on October 8th of 1871, Mrs. O'Leary went out to milk her cow around 8 or 9 o'clock at night. It's fairly dark out, so she has to bring a lantern with her to light her way. The cow is a little bit feisty that night, knocks over the lantern, setting her barn as well as the rest of the city ablaze. And of course, this story isn't really true. The newspapers at the time completely made it up. If you could believe it, in the 1870s, newspapers were more interested in selling copies than they were things like the truth. Of course, this never happens nowadays, but it did happen then. That's all this was, just a made-up story. Poor Mrs. O'Leary and her cow were vilified the rest of their lives, called a wicked old woman with a stupid-looking cow. Very unfair to both of them. And I was actually taught Chicago history for the longest time. Now, there are a lot of different stories out there about what might have actually caused that Great Chicago Fire. Nobody knows for sure. The truth of the matter is, it was definitely Chicago's fault. And we built our city entirely on wood. Came up with this balloon frame construction idea, a very cheap and easy way to build wood-framed housing. All these houses are built way too close together. The streets, as well as the sidewalks, were paved in wood. And we were going through a pretty heavy drought at the time, so everything was just terribly dry here as well. Did end up leaving a third of our population homeless. Over 100,000 people left without homes. Luckily, though, the casualties were at a minimum. Only around 300 people actually perished in that Great Chicago Fire, so a pretty low number considering all the damage it did. Off to the right here, we do have River City. I'll mention this really quick, just because another Bertrand Goldberg design, the guy who gave you those Marina City towers, the big corn-cob-looking ones, the guy who was revolting against the straight line. I think that's another very curvilinear structure. It's another city within a city. Dock your boat here, park your car in the back, you have a fitness center, place to sleep, paradise for shut-ins. You remember the story. More importantly, we have this very tall building. It's now looming in front of us here. This is, of course, the Sears Tower. By now, you've probably all heard that the Sears Tower is officially known as the Willis Tower. The Willis Insurance Brokerage Company came here from London a few years back. They bought up like 3% of the floor space inside the Sears Tower. And with that 3%, apparently came the naming rights to the building. And they thought they'd make a lot of new friends here in Chicago by renaming the Sears Tower the Willis Tower. So it is officially the Willis Tower. It has been for a few years now. We're just going to keep calling it the Sears Tower, though. So when the Sears Tower was finished in 1974, at 1,451 feet to the roof, that was good enough to make it the tallest building in the world. That was up until around 1996, when the Petronas Towers in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, surpassed our Sears Tower. Chicagoans were pretty upset about this. We became even more upset when we realized that the only reason the Petronas Towers were considered taller than our Sears Tower is because they had a spire on the top of their buildings. Now, a spire is nothing more than a hollow tube. Okay, you can't walk around in a spire. Really, can't do anything in a spire. It shouldn't even count. So, Chicagoans decided to do what we do best. We complained to the people who define what's tall and what's not. Surprisingly enough, there is a committee that meets on this and decides. It's the Council for Tall Buildings in the Urban Habitat. They exist. And we got them to create two separate categories. Now we had the world's tallest usable floor space, and the Petronas Towers had the tallest architectural top. Of course, all that would go out the window when in Taipei, Taiwan, they built the Taipei 101, topping out taller than the Sears and the Petronas in both categories. And more recently now, you've probably all heard the Burj Khalifa in Dubai, the United Arab Emirates, now the tallest building in the world. No relation to Wiz Khalifa from what I hear. But that building is something like 2,715 feet. So even if you were to go to the tip of the antennae on top of the Sears Tower there, which I do not recommend doing, that would be 1,725 feet. So still about 1,000 feet shy of that Burj Khalifa. The building is just insanely tall. Now, here in Chicago, we were planning a 2,000-foot building of our own. It was going to be called the Chicago Spire, but the funding for that project has been an issue lately, so those plans are on hold for the time being. As 311 South Wacker. It's done by Cohn Peterson Fox in 1990. They had a unique problem of designing their building right next to the world-famous Sears Tower. So how do you outshine the Sears Tower? How do you steal some attention away from it? Well, first you clad your building in pink Texas granite. Makes it stand out a little bit. Then you make it a weird octagon-like shape. Nobody's really using the octagon to its fullest potential nowadays. But then finally, you literally outshine the Sears Tower by putting a giant steel drum on the top of your building and filling it with around 2,000 fluorescent light bulbs. So when lit up at night, it is the brightest building in our city's skyline. And originally, it was so bright that birds migrating south from Canada were altering their migratory routes, thinking it was the moon. Now, since then, the wattage on the light bulbs has been lowered. It's a little bit dimmer now, still the brightest building in our city skyline, but now bird-friendly. That's what really counts. Off in front of us, we have this white building here. If you look to the top, there's a triangular section shooting up about 13 stories taller than the rest of the building. This was done by none other than Harry Weiss and Associates, the man I mentioned who seemed to be obsessed with the triangle. Just another interesting way of incorporating triangles into his buildings here. Now, you might notice as we approach, the lobby also has sort of a triangular theme to it. But if you look in between these two buildings, there's a nice clearing, and you get a really great view of the Sears Tower. You see the Sears Tower from the base all the way up to the roof. Giving you a really great idea of just how tall the building actually is. And if you look all the way to the top, you might be able to make out those glass balconies hanging off the sides there. It's a new observatory. Take a step out onto those, take a look straight down. It seems pretty terrifying to me. But you might want to check it out. Now, could you imagine climbing the Sears Tower, like from the outside, climbing up it? It's been done twice. Now, the first time, it was done by Dan Goodwin in 1981. The second time, more famously, was done by Alain Robert, a French daredevil with the nickname of Spider-Man. Now, he did it in 1999 without any safety riggings. No nets, no ropes, no safety harnesses whatsoever. Walked up to the building, started climbing. And he did make it all the way to the top, and he was greeted there by Chicago's finest. Yeah, he was arrested for trespassing, performing an aerial show without a net, and some other charges. Eventually they let him go. It's just a pretty heavy fine. The Sears Tower is done in a 9-bundled tube construction. You think of 9 sticks gathered together for strength. That's the basic idea behind it. Of course, each of those sticks is actually a 75 by 75 foot building. And 2 of them go to the 50th floor, 2 to the 66th, 3 to the 90th floor, then 2 all the way to the 110-story top. And with this bundled tube construction, the Sears Tower can actually sway 3 feet in either direction near the top, and it's gotten gale force winds. And it's meant to bend but not break, of course, meant to deal with some of the heavy winds we experience here. But now coming up off to our right, we have the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, or the MERC for short. The 2 40-story towers are flanking what used to be the central trade floor here. It was done by Fujikawa Johnson Associates in 1987. And they had a unique problem of designing 40,000 square feet of uninterrupted floor space in the center here, where the traders do all the signaling, jump around they tend to do. And they were worried that when they put in that trade floor, with all the weight settling and pulling on the 2 towers, the towers might start to cave inward. So what they did was very slightly bowed outward, the 2 towers they're constructing, just like 1/8 of an inch each floor up. So when the trade floor is put in, all that weight settled and pulled in the 2 towers, just pull them straight. It's a unique engineering feat there. But that trade floor is no longer a trade floor. The MERC merged with the Board of Trade here in Chicago a few years back. They've since renovated that space, just turned it into more offices. But now coming up to the Civic Opera building here, as it is very clearly labeled. Yeah, this is, of course, back when we spelled building with a V, I guess. We do nickname this building Insol's Throne, because if you crane your neck back, you might be able to make out it's in the shape of a giant armchair or throne. And it was commissioned by a man of the name Samuel Insol, the utilities king here in the city of Chicago. Worked for Thomas Edison in his heyday. Again, the building was commissioned by Mr. Insol. He was the original owner of the building. It was actually built by Graham Anderson, Probst & White, 1929. Again, a very unfortunate time. The Great Depression was looming. Mr. Insol would lose a lot of money, as well as his opera building here. And instead of consoling him, Chicagoans decided to make fun of him, and saying that upon Mr. Insol's death, his spirit would rise up and sit on his mighty throne. So that's actually where it's the nickname of Insol's Throne from. And there are a lot of different stories out there about why the building has that throne-like shape to it. One of them says that Mr. Insol had a daughter who went to New York to try her hand at opera. And she was so bad that she got booed all the way back here to the city of Chicago. So Mr. Insol decided to build her own opera building with its back turned to New York. There's a similar story, just instead of his daughter saying it was his wife. And another story saying he was upset with his downtown investors after the Great Depression hit. So he had the building built with its back turned to the downtown office buildings here in Chicago. Yeah, but the more likely story is probably just due to a zoning ordinance that was put in place in 1923. Nearly as thrilling. It said that only a quarter of your building could rise to its full height. The rest had to be at a city-ordained height. Then the lower section of the opera building there is actually where the opera stage is, so it can't support any higher floor space. It explains the whole throne-like shape to it. To the right, we have this red brick structure with all the ivy adorning its facade. This stands on a very historic site. It was right here in 1860 that a makeshift wooden structure known as the Wigwam was put up. The Wigwam was put up and taken down all within about a month, only to house one convention, the Republican National Convention of 1860, where we nominated Illinois' own Abraham Lincoln to run for president that year. So a pretty historic spot there. Good old Honest Abe was nominated. Then we have this building with a big curved glass front to it here. It's known just by its address as 333 West Wacker. Kind of like 311 South Wacker, just some other addresses. They're both Cohn Peterson Fox buildings. But 333 West Wacker is another post-modern building. Again, post-modernism, known for its contextualism, or just paying tribute to its location. Here you have alternating shades of green glass reflecting the green of the river. The big curve to the front of the building, referencing the big bend in the river here. As well as some circular vents near the base of the building, just meant to reflect portholes on a ship. So again, just paying tribute to its location here on the Chicago River. And this building is also thought to reflect that Chicago School of Architecture, that tripartite or three-part design. Here you have the stone base, the curved glass shaft, and the capital at the top is where the building actually changes its shape. It's sort of a trapezoid-like thing up top there. That's to come in line with the city's grid. But right next door, Cohn Peterson Fox would also do this building, 225 West Wacker. Again, just going by its address. Again, having a circular vent in the front, as well as some circular windows along the sides, reflecting portholes on a ship. But I'd like to mention the central section of windows here, because they're separated by these spandrels that have 4 rivets in a square. Why decorate your building with rivets? It seems like an odd decorating choice. But I'd have to do for your answer with one of many Chicago bridges, all the rivets on them. Again, this is what post-modernism is all about, just paying tribute to your surroundings. And Chicago is actually known for having the most movable bridges of any city in the world. At one time, we had around 52 movable bridges. Now we're down to about 36 that are all still fully functional, still go up and down whenever need be. And still far more than any other city in the world. And that's, again, the most movable bridges here, Chicago. And you mostly just see them going up and down on Wednesdays and Saturdays, certain times of the year. When the weather starts to warm up, all the sailboats head out onto the lake. Then when it starts to cool down, they all head back down the river. They set aside those 2 days a week for bridge openings for the sailboats to come through. There goes the L. It is quiet as a mouse. Right by my bedroom window at night. Hardly notice it. Well, off Off to the right, we have what was known as the Builders Building. It was done in the 1920s by Graham Anderson, Probst and White. You might notice the nice annex put on the side here with the big bay window sticking out. This building was renovated in the 1980s by Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill. They threw on that annex there. I like to point it out because it makes a lot of references to the original structure, kind of paying tribute to or blending in with the original design. And that still stands out in its own right with those big bay windows sticking out there. Then next door we have the LaSalle Wacker building. This is the remnants of that old city ordinance I mentioned really briefly. You see, in 1923, city officials thought they were scientists. They came up with this idea known as the canyon effect. It went something like this. They said if buildings here in Chicago kept rising so tall, eventually they would block out all the sunlight and the air to the streets below, slowly transforming Chicagoans into a race of mole people, scurrying about in the streets beneath. Yeah, I checked on that last bit myself. But they did say that only a quarter of your building could rise to its full height. The rest had to be at a city-ordained height to make way for the sunlight and air down the streets below. That ordinance has long since been thrown out. In case you're wondering what a Greek temple might look like if you were to stretch it to 50 stories tall, Ricardo Bofield has your answer. 77 West Wacker is originally the R.R. Donnelly building. I believe now home to United Airlines. There's that United sign up at the top. Yeah, but I mentioned this building mainly because of how beautiful it looks at night. As the night sky turns black, most of the windows in this building also turn black, and all the columns are lit up. So you just get this view of a giant Greek temple piercing the night sky there. It's a pretty great view late at night. A couple doors down, we have this tall plaid-looking building here, 35 West Wacker, home to the Leo Burnett Advertising Agency, called the Leo Burnett Building. This represents another idea in postmodernism, to just take a small piece of architecture, put it on a broader scale, this time taking the classical column and expanding upon it. There's the entire building, look like some giant column standing there, reflected in the base of the building, with all the columns there surrounding the base. And if you look off in front of us, past Morton's The Steakhouse, there's that green building with all the gold leafing at the top. Well, it looks almost like a giant champagne bottle. It was meant to look that way. It was done by the Burnham brothers back in the Prohibition years, back when alcohol was banned here in the United States. They're said to have been missing their champagne bottles. It was originally the Carbide and Carbon building, I believe now home to the Hard Rock Hotel. As we clear State Street Bridge, I'll pull your attention to the ground level. Off to the right, we do have Chicago Remembers. This is the largest Vietnam War memorial outside of Washington, D.C. It is right here now, straight off to the right. Then the building above it, the one with the dome in each corner, then the big center dome, was originally known as the Jewelers Building. It was done in 1926. The 1920s were a fairly rough and tumble time here in the city of Chicago, and people were concerned for the jewelers' safety. So that building was actually designed with a car elevator, so the jewelers could drive right into the building, and this elevator would lift them to their floor, so they could safely unload all the very precious merchandise. All this safety came into question when I learned that on the 40th floor in that big center dome there, none other than the notorious Chicago gangster, Mr. Al Capone, was said to be running a speakeasy in those days called the Stratosphere Lounge. So yeah, gangsters up top, jewelers down below. I'm sure it was all perfectly safe. But now we have this Hotel 71 here. You might notice a very slender white building that's attached to it. It is actually a separate building. It's known as Mather Tower. I pointed out because Mather Tower was the tallest building here in the city of Chicago for just 1 week. We're going through a pretty big building boom at the time. That building was topped off on the tallest. Then a week later, another building was a little bit taller. Yeah, we do go through these building booms from time to time. Went through one, we got the Sears Tower, the Aon Center, as well as the John Hancock Center, all within a few years of each other. Three of the tallest buildings as they stand here today. But now if you remember that Chicago Tribune Tower contest, the winners will be coming up off to the left here, Howells and Hood, the Tribune Tower. But then directly across the way, the first building, just on the other side of Michigan Avenue here, is 333 North Michigan Avenue. This building actually pays tribute to the second place design in that Tribune Tower contest. Second place design was done by Alil Saranin. His building was never actually built, but he did publish his design idea. When people around the city here saw this design, they realized that this was going to be the future of architecture. Leo Saarinen actually helped spread the Art Deco movement here in Chicago in the 1920s. So just a unique set of circumstances, even though he was the runner-up in that Tribune Tower contest. His design ended up having more influence on architecture here. That building was put up a few years after the design competition just to pay tribute to his second-place design. Off to the left, in between buildings, get a quick glimpse of the John Hancock Center here. It's one big X's running up its frame, 2 antennae shooting out the top. If you missed it the first time, get a more prolonged view of it here in just a moment. It is the 4th tallest building standing here in Chicago, 1,127 feet to the roof, just 9 feet shy of the Aon Center, which is the 3rd tallest. And here it is again now. Now, even though that is the 4th tallest building standing here in Chicago, they say you get the best views of Chicago from the John Hancock Center. And more specifically, they say that the best view is if you go to the 96th floor, the Signature Room Lounge. You take a look out the window of the women's washroom. Now, I personally have never been, but it appears to me that everyone who has been there seems to agree. It is indeed the best view of the city of Chicago. And from what I hear, they will occasionally invite gentlemen in, take a quick view out the window there, so it's not a terribly private washroom. But I guess you get a great view of the city. So go and check that out if you have some spare time. Now, off to the right, we have this large triangular building standing here. You might be able to guess who it was done by. None other than Harry Weiss and Associates, the man obsessed with the triangle. And this is home to the Swiss Hotel, a fine hotel and establishment, I'm sure. Harry Weiss actually did 2 triangular buildings here in the city of Chicago. This is one of them, the Swiss Hotel, and the other one we don't get a really good view of from the river. Yeah, but it is clad in stone and has very narrow windows. Yeah, it's actually home to our correctional facility here in Chicago. Now, I have not spent the night at either one of Harry Weiss's triangular buildings, so I can't really compare the accommodations. I do hear the Swiss Hotel is a fine place to stay. And coming into view from behind the Swiss Hotel, we get a great view of Aqua, this new building just went up here a couple years back by Ginny Gang and Associates. You notice each floor plate is uniquely curved and shaped, so it's supposed to look like waves are rippling through the building, just paying tribute to the surrounding waterways here. And coming into view from behind Aqua is the Aon Center, that grayish building with strong vertical lines running up it. The 3rd tallest here in Chicago, 1,136 feet to the roof. As I mentioned, just 9 feet taller, John Hancock Center. Now, before that was the 3rd tallest building standing here in Chicago. When it was done in 1973 by Edward Durrell Stone, it was the 1st tallest marble-clad building in the world. And not just any marble, Carrara marble from the Carrara Quarry in Italy. Michelangelo got his marble to do sculptures such as David, among others. As you can imagine, that building is very beautiful. White, opulent Carrara marble gleaming off the surface. But as you may also imagine, marble is very fragile. And going through some very cold Chicago winters and very hot Chicago summers, that marble was expanding and contracting, and eventually buckled, and was in danger of raining down precious Carrara marble onto pedestrians' heads beneath. And while nobody wanted to see a bunch of crushed pedestrians, they had to go up, take down all that marble, and reclad the building in the homegrown North Carolina granite. See adorning its facade today, having withstood the test of time. It actually cost more money to reclad the building than the original construction itself. Off to the left, we have this little empty plot of land. That's where the Chicago Spire was supposed to go up. That 2,000-foot building we're supposed to get here in Chicago. Right now it stands as a 75-foot hole in the ground. Those plans are on hold for the time being, and the funding has been the main issue there. Probably have to wait another 5-10 years to see if anything happens there. But now we are here east of Lakeshore Drive. I'd like to talk about a man by the name of Montgomery Ward, of all people. He actually fought 30 years of legal battles to keep all 29.4 miles of Chicago's shoreline forever free and clear of any private structures. No private buildings were ever to rise here east of Lakeshore Drive. Except that one, which is Lake Point Tower, a large private building standing here east of Lakeshore Drive. And it's snuck in on some of a loophole in the law. I guess train tracks used to run through here, and the railways had the rights to sell the air above their tracks. So again, this air rights loophole. It is the one and only private building here east of Lakeshore Drive. And Lake Point Tower is actually a tribute building, paying tribute to none other than Ludwig Mies van der Rohe. So the guy who did all the glass and steel box type buildings has this very curvilinear building in his honor. It seems counterintuitive. But actually, when Mies van der was studying at that Bauhaus in Germany in the 1920s, he drew a sketch of a building much like this one. Now, his building was only to be around 20 stories tall and stand in Berlin. But when he drew the sketch, the technology wasn't around to bend the steel that would be necessary. So when two of his students, Shipwright and Heinrich, came upon this sketch, they decided to show their gratitude to their professor by building Lake Point Tower here. When it was done in 1968, was the tallest all-residential structure in the world. Now we are going to be pulling into the dock here in just a moment. I do have to ask that you all just remain seated for the time being. Just kind of keep your places. It is a safety precaution. We have to get all the lines secured, the gangway in place. When everything's all set up, the captain will come out, tell you when it's safe to disembark the boat. If you don't mind just kind of hanging tight until then, we appreciate that. Well, we have a short moment here. Just take this opportunity to thank you all for coming out here, joining us here today. Hope you enjoy the rest of your time here in Chicago. Or if you're from Chicago, kudos to you coming out and enjoying the beautiful city here today. But again, thanks for coming out. Thanks for choosing Shoreline, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.